violence and animal abuse, banning the breeding and importation of captive dolphins, and campaigning against the use of animals in experimentation.
I just had to restart the stream quickly because she started into the intro.
About how she was working on securing legislative reform on the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. And I really want to mention that if you want a vegan tea or vegan merch, there are secondhand vegan teas and merch at the info booth. It's $5, and that money goes straight to Safe Pets, Safe Families. If you don't know Safe Pets, Safe Families, they will look after, or they try and look after your pet if you're in a domestic violence situation and you are worried about how to get out. So often we find that if you're in a domestic violence situation and you have a pet, you're much less likely to leave because you don't always find somewhere to go. I think a lot of people who are renting will know that it's tough to get a place with a pet. And so these people who are in the domestic violence situations will often stay for the sake of their pets. So Safe Pets, Safe Families do an incredible job in looking after the people and their pets. So please go and support them. Get your vegan merch at the info booth. And of course, you can donate to them in your own time. Have we got Emma Hurst ready in New South Wales? Emma, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Welcome to the Adelaide Vegan Festival, Emma. Can you give her a round of applause, please?
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And I also just want to give a big shout out as well to Safe Pets, Safe Beds as well. They do absolutely amazing work. We did a huge amount of work changing the domestic violence legislation here in New South Wales. And they were part of our roundtable on that as well, about working out what some of those gaps were. And as you say, so many people who are trying to leave violent situations have a companion animal at home and don't have the ability to live with the companion animal. And we know how close those relationships are that many people have with companion animals. And I think the statistic is about 80% of people who are in violent situations delay leaving violent situations because rental accommodation isn't animal friendly, because refuges aren't animal friendly. And so there's so much space that we need to fill there. We need so much more funding. But one of those is the charities like Safe Beds, Safe Pets, so Safe Families, so that those animals can actually go into a foster care situation for a temporary period of time until proper accommodation can be found. So their work is absolutely invaluable. Thank you again for having me here this afternoon. I wish again that I could be there in person, but of course we've had another strange year with ourselves absolutely thrown into lockdown. And the first thing that I want to say is just that, despite the setbacks that lockdown has put everybody in, that here at the Animal Justice Party, we have remained absolutely committed to the animals 100%, and that we have worked right through COVID as well, even when we've been working at home. So I thought I'd start just by giving a little bit of information about myself in case you haven't heard of me before, or if you haven't met me before. So I am Emma Hurst, and I'm a politician here in New South Wales. And I trace my passion for animals all the way back to when I was a young child. And I remember I was actually cradling a hen, and I was patting the hen, and the hen was purring. And we had rescued cats at home that we'd rescued from the Cat Protection Society when I was about 6. And I remember when I was holding this hen, I was thinking, this hen shows joy in the same way as my cat at home shows joy. But if I couldn't eat my cat, then how could I eat this hen? And so I went home and I wrote my parents a letter saying, I want to go vegetarian. I don't want to eat animals anymore. And so I went off meat when I was a very young child, but I was also a very naive vegetarian because I just thought all I had to do was not eat animal flesh. And it was many, many years later. And it was as simple as somebody handing me a flyer on the streets. And I went home and I looked up, the flyer was for Animal Liberation, the organization. And I went online and I read about how bobby calves are taken from their mothers and sent to slaughter in the dairy industry. And I read about day-old male chicks in the egg industry being macerated in giant blenders. And it was literally like the lights just went on. And in that moment, I knew that not only was I going to go vegan, but I really wanted to dedicate my entire life towards protecting these animals and actually speaking out for change. So I worked, I ended up switching to psychology because I knew that animal cruelty was a human caused problem and we needed a human focused solution. So I switched my studies from education into psychology. I worked for animal liberation for about a decade. I worked for People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and I've also worked for World Animal Protection International. And when I was asked to run for politics, I really asked myself the question, where am I best placed to help animals? And I could see so much fantastic work with people on the streets with TV screens, handing out flyers, working on that individual behaviour change. And I could see organisations like Animals Australia, Animal Liberation, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, working with companies and getting them to change and making sure that they choose ethical policies within their companies and have vegan options on menus. So I could see so much work happening there. But when I look into the political space, I could see that in New South Wales, they had banned greyhound racing and then backflipped on it, despite the expose that happened on the ABC showing about all the animal cruelty that occurred in that industry. And we could see federally that despite expose after expose of animal cruelty in the live animal export industry, the government's actually looking to expand the live animal export industry. So I knew that in politics we had so far to go, but that's all the more reason why we needed people in there, because it really holds back everything, and we would need change on that individual level and in the corporate level and also on that political level. So that's how I ended up in Parliament. But I thought I would take you through just a couple of the wins that we have achieved this year and also what we're now focusing on going forward as well. So prior to lockdown, we actually got quite a few really big achievement wins in right at the beginning of the year. So one of the biggest ones was essentially seeing the end of the use of cetaceans in entertainment. So this was something that we ran an inquiry on within New South Wales Parliament. And we saw some bans all around the world. So we saw a ban on the use of whales and dolphins in entertainment in Canada. And we're seeing a real shift all around the world, around Europe and other places as well. So we did an inquiry on that, and there are 2 dolphinariums essentially left in Australia. We've got one here in New South Wales in Coffs Harbour called Dolphin Marine Conservation Park. And we also have SeaWorld on the Gold Coast in Queensland. And what we discovered in that inquiry was that this was really a dying industry business model, that people were no longer interested in seeing animals being forced to perform circus-style tricks. So we knew that this was a dying business, and yet at the same time, places like SeaWorld were still breeding more dolphins into this industry. Now, a dolphin can live for about 50 years. The really sad thing about that is, you know, I'm 40 this year. And so the dolphins that I saw as a child in dolphinariums are still in these, you know, these artificial pools performing the same old repetitive, stupid tricks. And it's really quite depressing to think that that is still the life that they're living. Now, if a dolphin is born today, they could be alive in 50 years' time. And that's really distressing when we know that this is a dying business model. What happens to those dolphins when the community decides that in total that this is unethical? And already we were hearing that inquiry that community attitudes to this was already shifting, and people were already recognizing that we shouldn't be using animals in entertainment at all. So the changes that we ended up getting from that was with the Environment Minister here in New South Wales, who's a Liberal Party MP, and we banned the breeding of more dolphins in New South Wales, or any animal for that matter. So that would also include whales. And we also stopped the import of dolphins from other states or territories or other countries for the purposes of entertainment. So, and already wild capture was already illegal. So what that means is that SeaWorld or any other business can't set up in New South Wales because they wouldn't be able to access dolphins for it. It does mean that Dolphin Marine Conservation Park in Coffs Harbour is still currently functioning. However, they can't breed from their current dolphins, and I think that they might only have 3 dolphins left now. So, and we're working with World Animal Protection and other groups, and we're looking into the feasibility of a sea pen to retire those dolphins, and to work out what is the best outcome for those animals now, and how do we actually retire them out of the industry. So there's still some ongoing work there in that particular aspect. And of course, we're working with the Animal Justice Party in Queensland as well. I actually went and we did a big protest early on in the year outside SeaWorld on the Gold Coast. And to really create that pressure, now that we've got these laws in New South Wales, it does mean that Queensland is the only place in Australia that is still breeding dolphins for circus-style tricks in this sort of these entertainment venues. So that's going to be an ongoing campaign of ours as well. The other thing that we managed to do, we actually, in New South Wales, we've got some of the weakest penalties for animal cruelty right across the country. So for an act of animal cruelty in New South Wales, had a penalty of just $5,500 as the maximum. And so what we were seeing was people being charged $200 for absolutely heinous animal cruelty, because the judges look at $5,500 as the worst case scenario for an act of animal cruelty under the Protection of Cruelty to Animals Act. So it was actually the lowest right across Australia. And so we put up legislation to dramatically increase the penalties and double the jail time here in New South Wales, which would have made us the strongest right across the country. And as we put up our legislation, the government actually put up very similar legislation to ours after we had announced ours, which we were quite happy with. And we did. We saw 8-fold increases in penalties. And we also saw a doubling of jail time in New South Wales. And so we now have the strongest penalties for animal cruelty right across the country in New South Wales. Now, this is only the first piece of a much bigger issue. We know that there's still the problem of courts having a precedent to give much smaller fines. But the first step really is that our legislation reflects how serious of a crime animal cruelty is. So if we're looking at fines of maximum of $5,500, you can get a bigger parking fine, than some of the fines that we were seeing that were being handed out for acts of animal cruelty. So we needed to make sure that our legislation reflected how serious this crime was. And so that's the first step. And now obviously we need to look at, I know in the UK, they actually have guidelines the sentencing guidelines that they give to the courts to help make sure that the the criminal act actually matches the penalty. And so there's still a whole lot of work that we need to do in that space. But at the moment, we've managed to get that first step through and dramatically increase those penalties. The other thing that we managed to do, and I think that we're the first state right across Australia that has achieved this, was mandatory lifelong animal bans for people who are charged with serious or aggravated cruelty or any act under the Crimes Act. And so that includes things like bestiality, for example. And so what that means is as soon as somebody's charged, that's an automatic mandatory lifetime ban. They cannot work with animals. And they cannot have animals in their home that they're looking after either. So this was really, really important to put through. And hopefully, I know that Queensland, there were some people campaigning as well for the same laws to be passed there. And it's really important because I know that when we're looking at the courts and we're looking at the penalties that are being handed down, we were seeing that people, hadn't got any ban from being able to continue to work with animals or have animals in their care at home, or they would have a ban that would be for 1 year, for example. And, that was just really hideous. I mean, there was a major oversight actually in the entire legislation where if somebody had been found guilty of bestiality, the courts didn't even have the provision to ban them from having further animals in their care or working with animals. So that was a massive gap in the legislation that we fixed as well. The other interesting thing that we've done was we did an inquiry into the dairy industry in New South Wales. And it was interesting because it was an inquiry that the dairy industry themselves wanted. And it really has come from the premise that, you know, you go into the supermarket and you can see the alternatives, and you can see how enormous that industry has become. You know, you can get oat milk now, you can get macadamia milk. There are so many different options, and it's becoming more and more popular to switch away from cow milk consumption and actually switch to a lot of these plant-based milks. And so, I mean, I was outnumbered on this inquiry. There was myself as the Animal Justice Party, there was 2 Labor, there was the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers, and then there was 3 government, including, and one of those was a National Party MP. And the industry really came in. Essentially, they were asking for more taxpayers' money. They wanted more subsidies to prop up their industry for longer. They were asking for changes in labelling laws to, I guess, make plant-based milk less popular, or to confuse people, to make it less clear that it was a direct switch away from dairy consumption. They were also asking for dairy to be provided to children again in schools for free. And so, you know, they're really trying to build new avenues to try to sort of build their industry back up while consumers are switching away. And this is actually a really good example of why it's so important that the Animal Justice Party is actually in Parliament, because, you know, if we're not there sort of speaking against this, we've really got a situation where we as consumers are moving away from products that we don't want to support anymore. So we're saying, for environmental reasons, for animal cruelty reasons, for health reasons, we don't want to consume these products anymore. And so we're making a different choice. But the government can still use our taxes to prop up the industry that we no longer want to financially support through our grocery shops. So this is really important, and that's why it's really important that I was on that inquiry as well. And so when we did the inquiry, it was fantastic. We managed to get Vegan New South Wales there. We got Vegan Australia in there as well, giving evidence at the inquiry. And we also had an absolutely amazing woman. If you've not heard of her before, Jackie Norman, look up Vegan FTA, look up the work that Jackie Norman has been doing. Jackie was a dairy farmer herself, and then now she's a vegan. She's got, you know, her own vegan cookbook. And she was amazing because she was there at the inquiry, being able to speak from her own experience as a dairy farmer. So she talked about the heartbreak of the bobby calves, and she talked about, she's done a course on health. And so she was even able to talk about the health issues of consuming dairy as well. So she was fantastic. And I was able to use the evidence that all of these people brought to the table. And I asked for a recommendation for transformation. And so that actual recommendation is in the report. And what transformation means is that instead of our taxes going to prop this industry up, it's actually saying, let's use those tax money to transform those farming industries. So how do we actually transition them from being a dairy farm with cows on it to actually being plant-based farming? So that's what transformation is. It's actually helping fund and re-educate and work out how we can reuse that land towards plant-based agriculture. So we managed to get that up as a recommendation, and the government haven't yet responded. I think their response comes in the next few weeks. So it'll be interesting to see what the government says to that particular recommendation. But you'll be sure to sort of hear about it on our Facebook page and things like that. We'll make sure that information gets out there. Going forward, you know, some of our biggest campaigns at the moment, my biggest one, and one that we've spent many months drafting legislation on, is puppy farming, which is the intensive factory farming of dogs for a pet trade industry. In New South Wales, the puppy farming industry is just enormous. It's gotten a lot worse since COVID, and all these people have been wanting to buy dogs online. And it's also gotten worse since Victoria put in legislation It's fantastic that Victoria have this legislation, but essentially their legislation outlaws puppy farming. And so what we've got in New South Wales is all the puppy farmers in Victoria simply moving over the border into New South Wales, where our weak laws are doing virtually nothing to protect companion animals. There is no limit on the number of female dogs any person can have, and there's no limit on the number of litters any female dog can have. So you can have a 600 dog factory farm and force those female dogs to pump out litter after litter until literally their body gives in. And of course, it's legal to kill one of those dogs as well if they're no longer able to be bred from. So we've written our legislation. We introduced it a couple of weeks ago, and unfortunately the shooters put up a bid. They got the support of Labor to delay me being able to debate that piece of legislation. I'm still hoping to be able to do it in our last sitting week in November. At the moment, they've managed to tie my hands, which is very, very frustrating. But we'll see where we go with that legislation. I am, every time I do any media on this particular topic, people ask me, why is the Liberal National Government fighting against this? Why are they supporting puppy farming? And I honestly don't have an answer. I don't know why the Liberal National Government haven't done their own legislation on this to outlaw puppy farming. It's a really bizarre situation, but hopefully we'll be debating that in November, and obviously that's something that we will continue to push for. And obviously that's something that we need in every state and territory right across Australia. So, obviously that's a big fight that the Animal Justice Party will be putting on in every other place as well. The other thing I've been working on is a change to the working with children's check system. So my background, as I said, was in psychology. And so, last year we did a whole lot of legislative changes around the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. And so we got quite a few legislative changes through there, both to help protect animals and also to protect victims of violence. So this year what we've been doing is looking at the link between animal abuse and child abuse, because we know that people who are violent are violent. They don't discriminate on their victim. And so we held a roundtable online during lockdown. And one of the big things that we want to ensure is that the whole working with children's check system is changed. And this really came out of a case of absolute heinous animal cruelty here in New South Wales. And I won't actually detail exactly what happened, but it was just absolutely, this man is being charged with the most serious form of animal cruelty in New South Wales. And the court case has been going for 2 years, and he still has access to children. So he's still potentially visiting children in daycare centres, for example, in kindergartens. And that really highlighted to me, what is going on here. And what I discovered was that anybody that's charged with animal cruelty is not disqualified from getting a working with children's check. Even the most extreme forms of animal cruelty, they could still potentially pass a working with children's check. And to make it worse, because we've got private charities upholding the law, we've got the RSPCA and in New South Wales, we also have the Animal Welfare League. They're not mandatory reporters to the Children's Guardian. So even if people were charged, the Children's Guardian won't have that information unless it was the police that actually charged them. So we're looking for two changes. We're wanting to see that anybody that's charged with serious or aggravated animal cruelty is automatically disqualified. They cannot pass a working with children's check, and that would be a final decision. And that the RSPCA and that the Animal Welfare League are mandatory reporters to the Children's Guardian to make sure that that actually goes through. And then animal cruelty, which is another charge on its own, would be a trigger offence. And so what that means is that the Children's Guardian would be alerted if somebody had been charged under animal cruelty, and then they would do their own investigations. And it was interesting talking with the Children's Guardian about that, because one thing that they brought up was that there's a lot of coercion as well. And that's something that we've been looking at a lot in New South Wales. We've been looking at the space of domestic violence, for example, and the issue of coercion, and that, some people are being charged with animal cruelty as part of a domestic violence and coercion situation. So if it's a trigger offence, it does give the children's guardian the option of disqualifying them from passing a working with children's check or granting them for some of those situations that are a little bit more complicated. So we've been working with the minister, then the minister changed. And so, look, we're hoping to get something up on that very soon. Otherwise, it could be early next year. The other space that we've been working on is pounds. So during lockdown, there was a rural pound in New South Wales that actually shot 15 dogs, including a mother and her newborn pups. And this created shockwaves all around the world. And we went and had a look at the legislation, and unfortunately, it's not illegal. Now, there was 2 rescue groups that had put up their hand to actually take those animals. So we're now in the process of writing legislation. We also did a roundtable on pound reform, and we've got an enormous list of things that we need to do. And a lot of it has to do with desexing cats and running trap, neuter, return programs as well. So that's one large piece of it. But we're right now sort of urgently, after this Burke situation, writing up some legislation that we hope to either table this year or very early next year, depending on how long it takes us to finalise the legislation, that requires pounds to work with rehoming groups. So they have to try 2 rehoming groups, but also if a rehoming group puts their hand up to take any animal, they cannot kill that animal. So that's some important legislation that we're working on immediately. The other area that we're working on is the use of animals in experimentation, and we're really pushing for an inquiry on this. We did some what are called SO52s. It's essentially calling for government documents. And we have found all sorts of stuff around smoking mice models that are happening here in New South Wales, where they're forcing mice to smoke cigarettes. There's also what's called forced swim tests, which are really forced drowning tests. It just, as someone that's a psychologist, it's really quite horrifying to think. So essentially, they're putting mice in beakers with water, and the premise is that, if they're drowning and at the point at which they give in is indicative of the animal experiencing depression. Anybody, I think, that understands animal behavior or psychology would agree that that's not science. And that's still happening here in New South Wales, as far as we know. And there was also a whole lot of tick experiments that were done on dogs. And there was a potential biosecurity breach where these ticks had escaped into an area where they didn't actually exist. So we've done a fair bit of media on that, and we're still pushing for an inquiry. And this is all sort of also following on from the baboons that escaped from Royal Prince Alfred Hospital 2 years ago. Obviously there's a breeding facility for baboons for medical experimentation here in New South Wales. And there's a breeding facility for monkeys in Melbourne as well. And so I think that they can be shipped all around Australia for experimentation. It's just very difficult to find out any information about where these animals are going and what is being done to their bodies against their will. But it's a massive piece that we really want to expose and bring to the public. So we will keep working on that one as well. And I think that's going to be a major focus of ours next year as well. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was the Minister for Animal Protection. And this is something that is so important, and it's something that me and my team worked a lot on during lockdown. We've really got a big issue, and I think it's an issue that occurs all around the world, really, is that we've got a Minister for Agriculture that also has the portfolio of animal protection. And I said on Twitter the other day, having a Minister for Agriculture in charge of animal protection is like having a Minister for Mining in charge of the environment. It is such an enormous conflict of interest. And you can see that conflict of interest so clearly when I was talking about puppy farming. And the Minister for Animal Protection, who is in New South Wales, a National Party MP who's the Minister for Agriculture and the Minister for Animal Protection, and he won't act on puppy farming. He won't make puppy farming illegal. So then you sort of think, what hope do we have? And I think that that's why a lot of activists are very, very exhausted with the political process, because, you even talk about something as minimal welfarist as the use of battery cages in the egg industry. And these ministers aren't listening, because they represent primary industries. They represent the industries that use animals for profit. And so animal protection doesn't get a shoe in. It doesn't even get a second thought. And that's the really frustrating process. And so I think that to really see proper legislative changes that will protect animals, we need to separate that out. We need to have a minister for animal protection. And I know people have talked about an independent office of animal protection, and that's kind of the second step on. So yes, we still need an independent office of animal protection, but if we put in an independent office of animal protection and they report to the Minister for Agriculture, he's just going to ignore all of the work that office is doing. So we've still got a minister that's really under the thumb of the animal use industries. So we really need to separate that out. And even though if you've got a really conservative minister, it can still be quite difficult, it does mean that they're not representing specifically those industries that use animals. So I've actually got a petition up on my webpage, Emma Hurst MP, if you're interested in looking and reading more about that or signing the petition, because that's going to be a big focus of ours going forward as well. And I think that we've got another 10 minutes. And so I think we can open up to questions if there's somebody there with a mic.
Yes, we're here, Emma. Does anybody have any questions for the wonderful Emma? Pop your hand up. No questions yet. I actually have a question, Emma. I'll come down so you can see me, because I know it's a bit strange talking to me when you can't see me. It's very interesting when you become a vegan or an animal activist and you learn, like just listening to you speak then, you learn about all the ways in which animals are abused in our world. I mean, a lot of us here, I think, know about slaughterhouses. We might know something about puppy farming, but hearing you talk about things like the mouse swim test, the mouse drown test, and the baboon experiments, when you become a vegan or an animal activist, you just learn so many ways, and it can really weigh on you. So with your background as a psychologist, how do you involve yourself as deeply as you do in the work, but still, come out of it with a smile on your face and with your mental health in check?
I think there's kind of, I guess, two things to talk about here. I think first of all, there's the whole idea of making sure you have that time out and you have that sort of safe space for yourself as well. And so that means having other hats in your life, having other interests, and being able to separate yourself. And look, sometimes that doesn't have to be as far from activism as you think. I know that for me, if I go to a farm animal sanctuary, for example, and spend the day there, you're around happy people, you're around happy animals, and then that really does bring you some hope back. It might be going to a new vegan restaurant with a group of friends. And so, it can be anything. Or for some people, I know for Mark, who's the other MP, his big thing is going to the opera. And so, it's a way of actually sort of cutting off and just spending some time so that you can actually, regroup and refine yourself. And obviously making sure, and particularly, in Parliament, you're around people who you wouldn't normally be spending time with. And so, making sure you work really closely within your team and working closely with people who do care about animals, and just finding that base again is really, really important. The other part of that, and I think that this is really good where my sort of psych background comes in, is just remembering to challenge what we're thinking and to choose our thoughts. And so this has come in really handy, particularly since I've been in Parliament. And I'll often find myself, for example, the shooters will come out with this stupid press release. For example, we've got a political party in New South Wales called the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers Party. And obviously, they hate the Animal Justice Party, they hate me. And they'll often put out press releases that are completely false, that are, really extremist, drumming people up. And then, of course, all their people start sending us death threats and all sorts of awful things. And you can kind of get into this really frustrated mindset with dealing with people like that, and that kind of, trashy, backlash. And so one thing that I've found really helped is if you stop and actually think about what it is that you're thinking about this situation and choosing a different thought. So often I'll be finding myself getting frustrated with the content of what they're saying and the outcome of what they're saying. But one thought that I find really, really helps is I stop and I think to myself, we must be doing a really, really fantastic job for them to be so threatened to have to do that. And I immediately feel better because I've changed the way I'm thinking about this situation. And I'm reminding myself, well, if we weren't doing anything, then they wouldn't be retaliating with this sort of stuff. They wouldn't be putting out press releases about us. If we were sort of no one and not achieving anything, they wouldn't waste their time. So we must be doing a really fantastic job. And you'll instantly feel better. So I think sometimes we need to just stop and assess what the thoughts are that we're thinking about a particular situation. And I think that can work in any situation, is to reevaluate those thoughts.
That's so wonderful. And I think you're right, Emma. I've been involved with the Animal Justice Party to a small extent as well. And I can honestly say that I never think about the shooters, fishers, and whatever party, but they're thinking about us.
Yeah.
And you're probably the same. So I think that's really good advice. So thank you. Before you wrap up, does anybody else have a question for Emma? Is that yes? All right, let's do it. I'll bring you your mic. All right, go for it.
Hi, I was just wondering what the current rules are with like making kids do dissections in schools, and also like if they have to have school lunches, like if they're forced to eat animal products or stuff like that. So yeah.
Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually asked the Minister for Education about that recently. Students are allowed to make a conscientious objection to it, and they don't have to be in the room, and they don't have to be forced to do it. Obviously, we take a step further than that, and we think that they shouldn't be doing it at all. That they can learn just as much, from plastic models, for example, from videos, and so it's absolutely unnecessary for them to be continuing with dissecting animals in schools. So it is something that we've pushed with the Minister for Education. Unfortunately, in New South Wales, the Minister for Education is also a member of the National Party. So that makes it quite difficult. But and along with dissection in schools, as well as the use of hatching projects. And you speak to anybody that runs an animal sanctuary, and they'll talk about how much they hate hatching projects. And they'll often end up with all the roosters that get born. And I mean, some of these hatching projects, I think there's a duckling one, and the ducks are all then sent to an intensive factory farm for a few weeks and slaughtered. So it's another major issue. I believe that if there was sort of food provided, it would be the same thing, that, there could be a conscious objection. But again, I think that there needs to be more than that. And I actually had a large Hindu community reach out to me recently, and I presented at one of their big conferences. And they've asked me to provide information as well for their newsletters, because they said that they find that their children have struggled with this for a very long time. We all remember what it was like as children in school, being, a bit different to other people. And again, like you said in the question, if something is given to children to eat, and, for example, if there's a birthday cake and everybody's sharing it, and then one or two children say no, then, the spotlight is shone on them. And so it's quite difficult. And so I think that there also needs to be some more encouragement around teachers, and also normalization of that in schools as well. And making sure that, if you're not having that, then you're having something else as well, and making sure that that's part of the process, so that children aren't being left out or made to feel in any way different, because I think that's a really big area of problem as well that we need to address.
Emma, I might be wrong. I'm very happy to be corrected, but I think in certain veterinary programs as well, dissection is compulsory. And I have been told of vegans who have dropped out of those vet courses because they flat out refuse to do those dissections. They're there to help animals and they're being told to kill animals. When obviously we know that there could be an alternative. And it's a real shame because what we need in the veterinary industry is more people that care for all animals and care to them to the extent that we do. So to know that we're having really good people drop out of pursuing that path because of something so ridiculous is it's a shame.
Yeah, it is. And so when I was answering the question, I was thinking more in high schools. But you're right, there are different degrees at university that do require it. And it's interesting because in the US, there's a massive move away from that. And so it's quite frustrating that Australia, again, is so far behind. We still have so many animals being used in university courses. And, so much needs to change there. Part of it is legislation, but part of it is also the universities and that education system making that decision as well.
Okay, I can squeeze in one more quick question. If anyone else has got a question, pop your hand right up. Nope. All right, excellent. Emma Hurst, thank you so much. I said to Andy, we had Andy on earlier. I said to him that Victoria's had a bit of a tough time. Obviously, Sydney has as well. So I want to acknowledge that you've had a bit of a rough year, and thank you so much for doing the work you do for animals. We want to see you keep going and going. There's so much left to achieve, but you've achieved so much. So from all of us at Vegan Festival, thank you so very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, guys.
She's the best. I love her. I also love this lady. I've got Florence Lange here for you. So Florence is about to jump up here, but I'll let you know what's going on in some of our other stalls we've got. So at the Kids Zone, there's Nature Play, which is happening right now. At 3:30 p.m. at the Workshop Zone, which is the one at the very end, we've got Heading for Extinction. And this is Florence Lange. And I love this story that I've got about you, Florence. So Florence started playing ukulele after intending it as a birthday gift for her guitarist husband. It was too little for him, but it fit her just right. And now look at you. You've got the gig and your husband hasn't, so.
Oh, he's here watching, so he's
I see her watching. All right, I won't say anything else about her lovely husband. Please put your hands together for Florence Lange.